It was a cold, moonless night in the middle of nowhere, somewhere along a desolate stretch of highway in Nevada. The kind of road where the only light comes from your headlights and the only company is the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the asphalt. For 45-year-old trucker Carl Mitchell, this was just another night on the job. He'd been hauling freight for over 20 years, and long, lonely drives were nothing new to him. But this night would be different. This night would change everything. Carl was about an hour into his drive when he saw her, a young woman standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, signaling for a ride. She was dressed in a thin white dress that fluttered in the wind, her dark hair tangled and wild. Carl slowed his rig, his instincts torn. Picking up hitchhikers was against company policy, and he knew better than to risk it, but something about her made him pause. She looked so vulnerable, so out of place in the middle of nowhere. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The woman climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. Carl noticed how cold the cab became the moment she entered, as if the temperature had dropped by 20 degrees. He tried to make small talk, asking her name and where she was headed, but she just stared straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. Finally, she spoke in a soft, almost whispery voice. "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when to stop." Carl nodded, though a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. There was something off about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her eyes seemed to glint in the darkness, reflecting the glow of the dashboard lights. But he pushed his doubts aside, chalking it up to fatigue. He'd been driving for hours, after all. Maybe he was just seeing things. The miles rolled by in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind outside. Carl glanced at the woman occasionally, but she never moved, never spoke. Her stillness was unnerving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she pointed to a dirt road up ahead. "Turn here," she said, her voice barely audible. Carl hesitated. The road looked abandoned, leading into a dense patch of woods. There were no signs, no lights, no indication of civilization for miles. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Yes," she replied, her tone firm. "This is where I need to go." Reluctantly, Carl turned onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing over ruts and potholes. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The woman remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. After a few minutes, she pointed to a clearing. "Stop here!" Carl pulled over, his heart pounding. The clearing was empty, nothing but tall grass and shadows. "This is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. For the first time he noticed how hollow they looked, how empty. "Thank you," she whispered. And then before Carl could respond, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. Carl watched her walk away, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. She moved slowly, almost floating, until she disappeared into the trees. He sat there for a moment, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who was she? And why had she asked to be dropped off in the middle of nowhere? Shaking off his unease, Carl put the truck in gear and turned around, eager to get back to the highway. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cab was still cold, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. He glanced at the passenger seat and froze. There, on the seat, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Carl picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "You shouldn't have stopped." Carl's blood ran cold. He crumpled the note and threw it out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove faster, desperate to put as much distance between himself and that cursed clearing as possible, but the nightmare wasn't over. As he merged back onto the highway, Carl glanced in his rearview mirror and saw her. The woman was sitting in the back of the cab, her hollow eyes staring straight at him. Carl screamed and slammed on the brakes, but when he turned around, she was gone. Terrified, Carl pulled over and called the police. When they arrived, he told them everything, his voice shaking with fear. The officers listened patiently, but their expressions grew grim when Carl mentioned the dirt road. One police officer said, "That road's been closed for years. There's nothing out there but an old cemetery." Carl's blood turned to ice. The officers offered to follow him to the nearest truck stop, and Carl gratefully accepted. He never drove that route again, and he never spoke of what happened that night, but to this day, he swears he can still feel her presence, that icy chill in the cab of his truck, and the weight of her hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. And sometimes on quiet, moonless nights, he wonders if she's still out there waiting for the next trucker to make the mistake of stopping for her. For 38-year-old trucker Jake Thompson, the open road was his sanctuary. He loved the solitude, the freedom, and the endless stretches of highway that seemed to stretch into eternity. But one fateful night, while driving through the remote back roads of West Texas, Jake's love for the road turned into a nightmare he would never forget. It was around 2 a.m. when Jake first heard it, a faint crackle over his CB radio. He adjusted the dial, thinking it was just interference, but the crackle grew louder, more distinct. And then a voice came through, low and distorted, as if speaking through a wall of static. The voice said, "Hey there, driver. You're not alone out here." Jake frowned. He hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and the voice didn't sound like any trucker he'd ever heard. It was too flat, too emotionless. He picked up the mic and responded, "This is Big Jake. Who's out there?" The voice replied, "I'm right behind you, Jake. Always have been." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He glanced in his rearview mirror, but the road behind him was empty, swallowed by darkness. He shook it off, telling himself it was just some prankster messing with him. But the voice wasn't done. "You don't believe me, do you? Look again." Jake's hands tightened on the wheel as he checked the mirror once more. This time he saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance, barely visible through the haze of dust and darkness. The lights were too high to be a car, too low to be another truck. They didn't look right. "Who is this?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling. The voice chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Jake's spine. "You'll find out soon enough. Keep driving, Jake. I'll be waiting." The radio went silent, leaving Jake alone with the hum of his engine and the pounding of his heart. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just some bored trucker playing a sick joke. But the headlights in his mirror stayed with him, never getting closer, never falling behind. Hours passed, and the voice didn't return. Jake began to relax, convincing himself it was over. But then, as he approached a narrow, winding stretch of road, the radio crackled to life again. He heard a voice, "You're getting close, Jake, very close." Jake's blood ran cold. "Close to what?" he snapped, his patience wearing thin. "To the end," the voice replied, its tone almost gleeful. "Turn left up ahead, you'll see." Jake's eyes darted to the road. Up ahead there was a fork, a left turn leading into a dark, overgrown path, and a right turn that would take him back to the main highway. The voice was telling him to go left, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to go right. "Why should I trust you?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the headlights behind him suddenly flared, blinding him for a moment. Jake swerved, nearly losing control of the truck. When he regained his bearings, the headlights were gone, and the road ahead was eerily silent. Jake's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the wheel. He knew he should ignore the voice, should take the right turn and get as far away as possible. But something compelled him to go left. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear. But he found himself turning onto the dark, overgrown path. The road was rough, the truck bouncing over rocks and potholes. The trees closed in around him, their branches scraping against the sides of the rig. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was alive and watching him. After what felt like an eternity, Jake reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, abandoned truck stop. The building was crumbling, its windows shattered, and its sign hanging crookedly. But what caught Jake's attention was the truck parked in front of it, a rusted, beat-up rig with its headlights still on, illuminating the darkness. Jake's heart pounded as he pulled to a stop. He didn't want to get out, but something compelled him to step out of the cab. The air was cold, and the silence was deafening. He approached the other truck cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The truck's cab was empty, but the engine was still running, and then he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows of the truck stop, its face obscured by darkness. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice shaking. The figure stepped into the light, and Jake's blood turned to ice. It was a man, but he wasn't alive. His skin was pale and rotting, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He smiled, revealing a mouth full of broken, yellowed teeth. "I told you I'd be waiting," the man said, his voice echoing in Jake's mind. Jake stumbled backward, his flashlight falling to the ground. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, didn't stop, until he was back in his truck, speeding down the dark road. When he finally reached the highway, Jake pulled over and called the police. They searched the area but found nothing. No truck stop, no abandoned rig, no rotting man. They told Jake he must have been hallucinating. That fatigue had gotten the better of him. But Jake knew better. He knew what he had seen, what he had heard, and to this day he refuses to drive that stretch of road again, because he knows the voice is still out there, waiting for the next trucker to make the mistake of listening. For 52-year-old trucker Sam Reynolds, the job was his life. He'd spent over 3 decades on the road, hauling freight across the country, and he'd seen it all, or so he thought. But one night, while driving through the vast empty plains of Kansas, Sam encountered something that defied all logic, something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It started with a detour. Sam had been driving for hours when he saw the sign, "Road closed ahead, detour Route 17. He groaned, knowing this would add hours to his trip, but he had no choice. He followed the detour signs onto a narrow, poorly lit road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of nowhere, but as the miles rolled by, Sam began to notice something strange. The road didn't change. No turns, no intersections, no signs, just the same stretch of asphalt lined by the same fields of tall grass stretching on and on. Sam checked his GPS, but the screen was blank, no signal. He tried his radio, but all he got was static. He told himself it was just a glitch, that he'd reach the end of the detour soon. But an hour passed, then 2, and the road stayed the same. By now Sam's unease had turned to dread. He'd driven this route before, and it had never been this long. He pulled over to check his map, but when he looked at the odometer, his blood ran cold. According to the numbers, he'd driven over 300 miles, but the detour should have only been 50. Sam's hands trembled as he started the engine and pulled back onto the road. He drove faster, desperate to find an exit, a town, anything, but the road stretched on, unchanging, endless. The fields of grass blurred into a sea of shadows, and the sky above was a void, devoid of stars or moon. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted by his headlights. Sam slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. He expected the figure to move, to step aside, but it just stood there, motionless. Sam honked the horn, but the figure didn't react. Cursing under his breath, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, and the silence was deafening. As he approached the figure, his flashlight revealed a man in a tattered uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. Sam froze. "What do you mean?" "I'm just following the detour." The man shook his head slowly. "There is no detour. You're not supposed to be here." Before Sam could respond, the man pointed to the side of the road. Sam turned his flashlight and his heart stopped. There, in the tall grass, was a row of rusted, abandoned trucks, dozens of them, their cabs empty, their windows shattered. "What is this?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing as if he'd never been there. Sam stumbled back to his truck, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he had to get out of there. He drove faster, pushing the truck to its limits, but no matter how fast he went, the road stayed the same. The fields, the grass, the endless stretch of asphalt. It was like he was trapped in a loop, a nightmare with no escape. Hours passed, or maybe days. Sam couldn't tell. Time had lost all meaning. His fuel gauge was dangerously low, and his body was numb with exhaustion. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw something up ahead. A light. Sam's heart leapt as he approached. It was a gas station, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. He pulled into the lot, relief flooding through him. But as he stepped out of the truck, his relief turned to horror. The gas station was abandoned, its windows broken, its pumps rusted and lifeless. The light he'd seen was coming from a single bulb, swinging from a wire above the door. And there, sitting on the steps, was the same man he'd seen on the road. "You still don't understand, do you?" the man said, his voice hollow. "This is where you belong now." Sam shook his head, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The man stood and walked towards him, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've been here before, Sam. You just don't remember." And then it hit him. Memories he didn't know he had. Flashes of this road, this gas station, this man. He'd been here before countless times, trapped in this endless loop, this purgatory of asphalt and shadows. Sam stumbled backward, his mind unraveling. He turned and ran, but the road stretched on, endless and unchanging. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually he collapsed, his body too weak to go on. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his truck, driving down the same stretch of road. The detour sign loomed ahead, and the voice of the man echoed in his mind. "You're not supposed to be here." Sam didn't stop this time. He kept driving, knowing he'd never escape, because the road wasn't just a road, it was a prison, a nightmare without end, and somewhere in the darkness the man watched, waiting for the next lost soul to join him on the endless highway. And there you have it. 3 spine-chilling tales from the dark, lonely highways where the unimaginable becomes real. From phantom hitchhikers to eerie radio transmissions, these stories remind us that the open road can be as terrifying as it is freeing. If these tales kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more hair-raising content. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story, because the next one might just make you think twice before turning on your CB radio or picking up a stranger on the side of the road. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see in your rear-view mirror. Drive carefully.